Henry Whitaker had lived through 74 years of predictable timber and steady nails, but nothing in his career as a master carpenter had prepared him for the sight he found beneath the ancient, rotted oak at the edge of the Willamette Reserve. His house cat, Solace, a creature of silk and domestic comfort, was no longer just a pet. In the flickering beam of a dying flashlight, Henry watched as she stood guard over 3 trembling lives that didn't belong to the world of men, her cream-colored fur matted with the blood and mud of a wild mission that would either be a miracle or a tragedy. The rhythm of Henry's life was written in the movement of shadows. Ever since Elaine had passed 3 years ago, the house had grown into a vast, silent museum of shared memories. He found himself measuring time not by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, but by the way the afternoon sun hit the cedar floorboards. He was a man of wood and stone, a retired carpenter who understood the world through things he could touch, measure, and join together. But grief was a material he couldn't sand down. It remained rough, a constant splinter in his heart that only one thing could soothe: Solace. Solace was an American shorthair with fur the color of heavy cream and eyes that looked like burnished gold coins. Elaine had brought her home just 2 months before the cancer finally took her. "A final gift," Elaine had whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "She'll lead you to something beautiful, Henry. Just watch her. She sees the connections we miss." 4 years. Henry thought the miracle Elaine mentioned in her final letter was simply Solace's ability to sense his heart condition. Whenever his chest tightened and the world began to spin, Solace was there, her insistent, piercing meow acting as a physical tether to the world of the living. She had saved him from the brink of unconsciousness more than once. But as the first frost of late autumn began to lace the windows of their Oregon home, Solace changed. The change started at the window. Normally, Solace was a shadow at Henry's heels, following him from the kitchen to the workshop. But now, she sat for hours at the large glass pane facing the northern woods. She wasn't watching birds. She was staring into the deep, dark line of the forest reserve, her body perfectly still, her tail twitching in a rhythmic, agitated code. She stopped eating. Her gold eyes, once warm, became wide and unblinking, reflecting a call Henry couldn't hear. On a Thursday night, the silence of the house was shattered by the shrill ring of the landline. It was Sarah Greenfield from the Willamette Wildlife Rescue Station. She spoke with a professional urgency that made Henry's pulse quicken. They had tracked a signal from a tag bobcat, a mother, who had been injured by an illegal trap. The signal was fading near Henry's property line. "Have you seen anything, Mr. Whitaker? Anything unusual?" she asked. Henry looked at Solace, who was currently pawing frantically at the back door. "No," he lied, though he didn't know why. "Nothing but the wind." When he hung up, he realized the back door was ajar. A draft of cold, damp air was snaking into the kitchen. Solace was gone. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced his chest. Solace was a house cat. She wouldn't survive a night in the Willamette, especially not with coyotes and injured bobcats roaming the brush. Henry grabbed his heavy wool coat and his old maglite. He didn't care about his heart condition or the protests of his 74-year-old knees. He stepped into the darkness. The forest was a wall of black. The beam of his flashlight felt pitiful against the vast indifference of the old-growth pines. "Solace!" he called, his voice sounding thin and fragile. He wandered for 20 minutes, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until he saw it, a flash of cream-colored fur disappearing behind a tangle of ferns. He followed her deeper than he had ever ventured. The terrain sloped downward toward an abandoned riverside scrapyard, a place where rusted machinery was being slowly eaten by moss. Henry slipped on a wet root, tumbling down a steep incline. His flashlight flew from his hand, the world spinning into a blur of pain as his head struck a rock. He lay there in the gray space, that terrifying middle ground between waking and sleep. He could smell the rot of wet earth. He felt the cold seeping into his bones. Then he felt a pressure on his cheek. A rough tongue licked the blood from his temple. "Solace!" he croaked. She was sitting on his chest, her eyes glowing in the dark. She wasn't purring. She was meowing with an urgency he had only heard during his heart attacks. But she wasn't trying to wake him for his sake. She was pulling him toward the scrapyard. Henry found his flashlight, the lens cracked but the bulb still flickering. He leaned on a fallen branch and followed his cat. She led him to a massive oak stump, a 6-foot-wide relic of a tree that had been hollowed out by decades of decay. Solace stopped at the opening and looked back at Henry. He knelt, his joints popping, and shone the light inside. His breath caught. 3 pairs of eyes reflected the light. They weren't kittens, at least, not domestic ones. They were bobcat kittens, their coats spotted and matted with mud. They were huddled together, shivering in the damp hollow. One of them, the smallest, was trembling so violently Henry thought it was already dying. Solace didn't hesitate. She stepped into the hollow and lay down. The wild kittens, driven by a primal need for warmth, crawled toward her. They burrowed into her cream fur, and Solace began to groom them, her tongue moving with a mother's rhythm. In that moment, the carpentry of Henry's world changed. He realized that for 3 nights, Solace hadn't been wandering. She had been nursing them. She had been their heat source while their mother, injured and trapped somewhere in the dark, couldn't return. Solace had found the miracle Elaine had promised, not a miracle of receiving, but a miracle of giving. Henry's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. He had 1 bar of signal. He called the rescue station back. "I found them," he whispered, looking at his house cat acting as a surrogate mother to the wild. "I found the kittens. But you need to hurry. One of them doesn't have much time." Rick Dalton, a rugged man from the Forest Service, arrived 40 minutes later. He moved with a practiced efficiency, but even he stopped in his tracks when he saw the scene in the hollow oak. "I've been doing this 20 years, Rick whispered, his breath a cloud in the cold air. "I've seen cross-species fostering in captivity, but never a domestic cat venturing into the wild to save a predator's litter. She saved their lives, Henry. In this temperature, they would have been gone by midnight." They worked together to move the kittens into a padded carrier. Solace watched every move, her body tense, a low warning rumble in her chest whenever Rick moved too quickly. When they reached for the smallest kitten, the one they would later name Pimble, Solace placed a gentle, clawless paw on Rick's hand. "I know, girl," Rick said softly. "We're going to fix them." As the rescue truck pulled away, Henry stood in the driveway with Solace in his arms. She was exhausted, her fur ruined, her body shivering. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, turning the frost on the trees into a million tiny diamonds. Henry walked back into his quiet house. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause between breaths. He fed Solace a bowl of warmed cream and watched her fall into a deep, twitching sleep on Elaine's old armchair. But as Henry sat there, sipping a cup of tea, he looked out at the forest. He knew the story wasn't over. Solace was still staring at the door in her dreams. The mother bobcat was still out there, and Solace had formed a bond that the walls of a house could no longer contain. He picked up Elaine's letter from the dresser and read the last line again. "Family doesn't have to be the same species, Henry. It just has to be the same heart." He looked at Solace and realized that his quiet retirement was over. The forest had come knocking, and thanks to a cream-colored cat with a heart too big for her ribs, Henry Whitaker was about to learn that miracles are often messy, wild, and very, very loud. For 5 days, the Whitaker household was a place of deceptive quiet. Henry had assumed the mission was complete. He had watched the rescue truck disappear with the 3 spotted bundles, confident that they were in the best hands possible. He spent his mornings calling the Willamette Wildlife Rescue Station, receiving updates from Rick and the head of the station, Dr. Lillian Moore. He learned their names: Vuna, the sick one who was finally responding to antibiotics; Pimble, the runt who refused to eat unless a staff member wore a fur-scented glove; and Mira, the feisty female who was already trying to scale the walls of her enclosure. Artha, their biological mother, was also recovering in a separate wing, her trap wounds healing under the watchful eyes of the vets. But while Henry felt a sense of closure, Solace did not. The cream-colored cat had become a ghost in her own home. She ignored her premium kibble and spent her hours crying softly at the back door, her golden eyes fixed on the tree line with a haunting intensity. On the 5th morning, Henry found her carrying a faded blue yarn ball, her favorite toy, out into the fog. Curious and a bit concerned, he pulled on his boots and followed her. He watched from a distance as she navigated the familiar path to the hollow oak stump. She didn't play with the toy. Instead, She tucked it deep into the shadows of the rotted wood. Over the next 48 hours, she made several more trips, transporting a stuffed mouse, a rubber ball, and even a length of silk ribbon Elaine had once used for her hair. "You're furnishing it," Henry whispered, leaning against a nearby pine. "But they aren't coming back." Solace. "They're safe now." He was wrong. The following Saturday, a heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling the sounds of the forest. Henry was jolted awake by a frantic scratching at the back door. When he opened it, Solace was sitting on the porch, her fur damp and her chest heaving. And there, huddled behind her, was Pimble. The little bobcat kitten looked up at Henry with bright, intelligent eyes, its movement significantly stronger than when it had first been rescued. Solace didn't wait for an invitation. She turned and marched back toward the forest, and Pimble followed her with a devotion that was almost painful to witness. Henry, his heart hammering against his ribs, grabbed his coat and followed them to the hollow. What he found there defied every logical thought he had ever possessed as a man of facts and measurements. In the center of the nest, Solace had built with her toys, and dry leaves sat all three kittens. Vuna was curled up sleeping, her breathing deep and rhythmic. Mira was batting at the silk ribbon, and Pimble had already climbed back into the hollow to groom Solace's face with clumsy, affectionate licks. Henry's hands shook as he dialed Rick Dalton. "They're back," he said, his voice cracking. "All three of them. They're at the hollow." "That's impossible, Henry," Rick snapped, though his voice was filled with confusion. "We checked the enclosure 10 minutes ago. They're secure." He paused, and Henry heard the sound of a door slamming and Rick shouting for Dr. Moore. An hour later, Rick's truck skidded into the driveway, followed by Dr. Lillian Moore. They examined the kittens, confirming through their tags that these were indeed the same animals. The mystery of how was solved later that afternoon when Lillian pulled up footage from the rescue station's wildlife cameras. The grainy infrared video showed a cream-colored shape, Solace, navigating the 3-mile journey from the forest to the rescue station over 3 consecutive nights. She had located a gap in the security fence too small for a human, but just large enough for a determined house cat. The camera captured her entering the enclosure and carrying the kittens out one by one, gripping them by the scruff of their necks exactly as a mother would. She had transported them through 3 miles of dense, predator-filled wilderness, returning them to the only safe place she knew, the hollow oak stump. "I've never seen anything like this," Lillian admitted, her voice hushed with awe as she watched the footage. The level of problem-solving, the physical endurance, she was willing to die to bring them home. Rather than taking them back to the cold metal of the station, Dr. Moore made a radical decision. "The kittens are healthy enough now, and clearly they have a guardian. We'll monitor them here." For the next 2 weeks, Henry's backyard became a theater of the miraculous. He visited the hollow daily, bringing high-protein food for Solace so she wouldn't have to hunt as hard, though she often ignored it to hunt for the kittens herself. He watched her bring back small fish from the creek and field mice, teaching the wild kittens the mechanics of the hunt. Solace taught them to be wary of the world. When a neighbor's chainsaw roared to life, she didn't run. She herded the kittens into the deepest part of the stump and stood guard at the entrance. She groomed them obsessively, her cream fur often stained with the dust and mud of their play. Pimble, the runt, developed a habit of climbing onto Solace's back, riding her like a tiny cowboy through the ferns. Henry sat on the cold ground nearby, leaning against the stump, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. He watched Solace sacrifice her own comfort, eating only after the kittens had finished, and sleeping only when their 3 small hearts were beating in synchronized slumber. She was, in every way that mattered, their mother. But as the kittens grew larger and their spots became more defined, the reality of the forest began to settle in. They were becoming too big for the hollow, and their wild instincts were sharpening. One afternoon, Henry received an envelope from Lillian. It was a photo of Artha, the mother bobcat, standing at the edge of her enclosure, her eyes fixed on the north, looking for the children she had lost. "She's ready, Henry," the note read. "It's time for the final reunion." Henry looked at Solace, who was currently pinned under a playful attack by Mira and Vuna. He felt a lump form in his throat. He knew that to do what was right, he would have to ask Solace to give up the very thing that had brought her back to life. He thought of Elaine's letter about miracles and beauty, and he realized that the hardest part of a miracle isn't witnessing it, it's having the courage to let it go. The weight of a decision, the finality of the situation sat heavily on Henry's kitchen table in the form of a manila envelope from the Willamette Wildlife Rescue Station. Inside was a photograph of Artha, the mother bobcat, standing in her recovery enclosure. She looked magnificent. Her trap-shattered leg had healed into a silver-pink scar beneath her thick winter fur, and her eyes held the fierce, piercing clarity of a predator restored to her power. But it was the note from Dr. Lillian Moore that made Henry's hands shake. "She is searching for them, Henry. She spends her hours at the corner of the enclosure, looking north toward your woods. It is time." Henry sat for a long time, staring at the photo, and then at Solace, who was currently curled up on the rug. He thought about how much life these 3 small, spotted orphans had brought back into a house that had been a tomb of silence since Elaine's passing 3 years ago. He thought about Pimble, the runt who now had the strength of a tiger, Vuna, whose fever had been broken by Solace's constant grooming, and Mira, the most independent of the 3. He thought about Elaine's letter, the one she had tucked away for him to find behind the wooden cabinet in the hallway. "This cat will bring you a small miracle," she had written in her careful script. Henry finally understood that the miracle wasn't just the saving of the bobcats. It was the reawakening of his own heart, a heart that had been as dormant as a winter seed until Solace forced him back into the woods. The journey to Mount Hood. The reunion was set for a bright October Saturday. Rick Dalton and Dr. Moore arrived early in a Forest Service truck, carrying a large transport carrier. When they walked toward the hollow oak stump, Solace's reaction was immediate. She didn't flee. She placed herself directly between the humans and the kittens, her body rigid, a low, guttural growl vibrating in her chest. It wasn't the sound of a house cat. It was the sound of a mother defending her soul. Henry knelt in the damp leaves beside her, his 74-year-old knees cracking in the silence. "They need their real mother, my dear," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief he hadn't felt since he stood at Elaine's bedside. "You've given them a chance at life, but they need to be wild. They need to learn the things we can't teach them." Solace looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face for a long, agonizing moment. Then, as if understanding the weight of his words, her body relaxed. She turned back to the kittens one last time. She moved to Pimble, licking the top of his head with slow, deliberate strokes. She touched noses with Mira and groomed the face of Vuna, a final benediction of silk and spit. Then, she stepped back and sat beside Henry, watching in silence as Rick gathered the kittens into the carrier. They drove west toward a release site far from the reach of illegal traps and logging roads, a protected area near Mount Hood. Artha was already there, pacing inside a large temporary enclosure. When the carrier was placed near her and the door opened, the air seemed to crackle with recognition. Artha rushed to the wire mesh, making sounds Henry had never heard from a wild animal, cries that were part joy, part relief, and part primal anguish. The kittens, hesitant at first, suddenly seemed to recognize something essential. Pimble was the first to reach the barrier. When the mother and son touched noses through the wire, Henry felt hot tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "She's telling them she never stopped looking," Dr. Moore whispered, watching through her binoculars. The void and the shadow. The weeks that followed the release were the hardest. The house felt emptier than it had in the months after Elaine's funeral. Solace stopped eating properly again, her golden eyes no longer bright with purpose, but dimmed with something that looked like grief. She spent her days on the windowsill, staring at the forest, waiting for the sound of tiny, spotted paws that would never come home. Henry tried everything, special treats, new toys, and longer brushing sessions, but nothing helped. He understood that waiting, he had done it himself. He had waited for Elaine to come through the kitchen door, to touch his hand in the night, until that waiting became a kind of illness. In late November, a world transformed by heavy mist settled over Willow Creek. Henry woke to find Solace already gone from her usual spot. He pulled on his robe and went to the back door, where everything was soft-edged and dreamlike. Solace was in the garden, sitting beneath the large pine tree, staring toward the forest. Then, a shape emerged from the fog, larger than Solace, smaller than a full-grown bobcat, moving with fluid, lethal grace. It was Pimble. He was lean and strong, his coat thick with winter fur. He did not approach the house, but he stood just 30 feet away and looked directly at Solace. Neither moved. The moment stretched out, charged with memory and a recognition that had no name. Then Pimble turned slowly and walked back into the forest, disappearing like smoke into the white morning. He had come back just once to show them he was all right, to close the circle. Solace came in sight an hour later and, for the first time in weeks, ate an entire meal. That night, she slept at the foot of Henry's bed, her purr a steady, comforting vibration that signaled the return of her spirit. The new rescue team. As winter settled in fully, muffling the world in white silence, Henry thought the story had reached its conclusion. But routines, he was learning, were meant to be broken by small miracles. One afternoon in early December, he noticed Solace behaving strangely again. Oh, she was carrying items in her mouth, a piece of old cloth, dry twigs, and a clump of dried grass. She was taking them to the hollow oak stump. Henry set down his broom and followed, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in his chest. Inside the stump, he found a carefully constructed nest. In its center were 4 tiny, dirty kittens, strays that had somehow found their way to this place that Solace had made sacred. Solace was already with them, grooming a gray tabby with white paws. Henry didn't call the rescue station immediately. Instead, he went to his garage and found old lumber, chicken wire, and a weatherproof tarp. He spent the rest of the day building a small, insulated shelter beside the house, protected from the wind and rain. He installed a heat lamp and a feeding station. When it was finished, he and Solace worked together to move the kittens to their new home. Over the following weeks, they became a team, the rescue team. Henry realized that these small lives mattered, and the choice to help rather than look away was what filled the hollow places in his heart that grief had carved. The legacy of the heart. On a snowy evening, with the fire burning warm, Henry took out his old leather-bound journal, the one Elaine had given him 20 years earlier. He had not written in it since her death, but now he found a blank space that seemed to have been waiting. He picked up a pen and wrote slowly, "Elaine, I understand now. A miracle doesn't have to be something grand. Sometimes it's just a cat that knows how to love and makes this old heart tremble again." A week later, a large envelope arrived from the rescue station. Inside was a photograph from a motion-activated camera showing 4 bobcats walking single file along a creek bank. Artha was in front, followed by her 3 offspring, now nearly full-grown. Beside Pimble walked a younger female, and behind them were 2 small cubs, their spots bright and clear. Rick Dalton had attached a card. Perhaps what Solace taught is still being passed on. The legacy continues. Henry placed the photo in a wooden frame beside the picture of Elaine. He took a purple pen and wrote on a small piece of paper that he tucked into the frame, "Family doesn't have to be the same species." The house that had been so quiet was filled once again with the sounds of life, purpose, and love. In the forest beyond, Pimble walked with his family, teaching his cubs what Solace had taught him, that families are built not from blood alone, but from acts of fierce and gentle care. Henry Whitaker lived each day knowing that Elaine had given him a gift that kept giving, a small cream-colored cat who had shown him that even in the winter of life, spring could come again.